Welcome back and welcome to this video on the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. So you just heard in my other video about the water cycle and the phosphorus cycle. And I'm just going to remind you that the water cycle and phosphorus cycle are a bit easier because you're not really dealing with chemical changes there. You're just dealing with H2O moving around, changing physically. It might freeze, it might evaporate, it might condense, it might percolate through something, but it's fundamentally still the same stuff chemically. And similar deal with phosphorus cycle, which is really always going to involve phosphate. Now, of course, when water enters an organism or when phosphorus as phosphate enters an organism, well, then it can become part of the organism and it might get integrated into a different molecule. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, like if you consume phosphate, and really you probably wouldn't, you maybe in trace amounts depending on the application, but if you consume phosphate as, part of your diet, what you're really eating is nucleic acids, right? So that's the context that you'd find phosphate in, as I pointed out to you, when it's in a living thing. When it's out in the environment, it's just free phosphate a lot of the time. So the chemical changes in those cycles are not as significant. It's mostly just physical transformations, right? Now, these cycles are going to be trickier because they do involve chemical transformations. So make sure you manage that, okay? So nitrogen cycle, let's start there. It's a little bit easier than the carbon cycle in terms of amount of stuff to know. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the room around me and you right now. The nitrogen gas in the air composes about 80%, just below 80% of the atmosphere. And nitrogen gas, as you probably learned in chemistry, if you learned about it, is very unreactive. It's very stable. That's because it has a triple bond between the two nitrogens that make up N2. Now, if we have one bond, we know each other. If we have two bonds, we're close friends. If we have three bonds, we are inseparable. And it turns out that's more or less the case with nitrogen when it's in molecular nitrogen, or N2. It's a gas that basically doesn't do anything. Take a deep breath in, breathe it out. You just inhaled 80% N2 and it did nothing and it came right back out unless it dissolved a little bit in your blood, and then it will move around your body and you'll exhale it later. N2 it's good that it's not reactive because it means when you inhale and exhale it, it doesn't react with you and damage anything, right? But the downside to this is that nitrogen is needed to make proteins and nucleic acids, right? And organisms therefore need to get their hands or roots or leaves or whatever the case may be on nitrogen. And here we are inhaling 80% nitrogen and it's useless. It goes right back out because it won't react. It won't actually become a part of us. It just kind of comes in and out, in and out. And the plants outside my window and yours, they're surrounded by nitrogen all the time, but they cannot use any of it. The chemical transformation that is the first you need to know in the nitrogen cycle is called nitrogen fixation. And a nitrogen fixation, molecular nitrogen, N2 from the air, gets converted into a different form, a form that is reactive and that does become useful for making proteins and nucleic acids, okay? Those forms, we could get into details here and worry about which one comes first and which ones come later and what the transformations are chemically like. If you do get into soil science later, you'll certainly learn a lot about that, or into nitrogen cycling in general. But for APES purposes, we basically just need to know that they exist and that they are useful forms of nitrogen. So N2 is in the air. It is not reactive, not particularly useful. But if nitrogen fixation occurs, then ammonia, NH3, ammonium, NH4+, nitrate, NO3-, and nitrite, NO2- are all possible products that can form through nitrogen fixation. The reactions that take place to form those are complex. There are a series of them. They take place in different amounts and in different manners and potentially even in different orders, depending on what organism and what context we're talking about. So we're not going to worry too much about exactly what that looks like. We're just going to say those are the four that are useful and that will potentially form if nitrogen fixation occurs. So be clear, that nitrogen comes from the gas and it becomes part of these useful forms, or bioavailable. It's available to living things. Bioavailable is another way to say it. Now, ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, and ammonium. How do we make those out of nitrogen if it's so unreactive? Well, imagine someone who's really low energy. One way to wake them up is to zap them with lightning, don't you think? And it turns out actually that that is one way of doing nitrogen fixation. If you blast nitrogen with enough energy, basically N2 with enough energy in the form of lightning, it will cause it to react and to form bioavailable nitrogen. Now, if the whole world has to wait for lightning to strike in order to access nitrogen to produce proteins and nucleic acids, then there's not going to be very many living things. So thank goodness that there is a different form of nitrogen fixation done by bacteria. These bacteria tend to live in two places. One is they live in the soil. Another is they live in the roots of plants called legumes. That's if we're thinking about terrestrial environments. There are also some types of algae, and really properly they're actually types of bacteria as well, but we won't worry about the distinctions in biology here. There are certain types of algae in the ocean that can do nitrogen fixation as well, okay? And so either algae in the ocean or bacteria in the soil or in the roots of legumes can do this as well. And what they do is they invest some of their own energy in pulling that N2 out of the air and making it bioavailable. Now, that makes there be a lot more nitrogen. You also, if you're a gardener, might be familiar with this. Like if you need to add fertility to your soil, nitrogen is a major nutrient that leads to soil fertility, as we'll learn more about later in the class. And of course, N2 isn't soil fertility. That's just gas that's useless. But if you convert that through nitrogen fixation into one of these bioavailable forms, it becomes useful. And so growing legumes, like a rotation of legumes in your garden, you don't even have to harvest anything. You can seed them, let them grow, and then grind them into the soil. It adds a lot of nitrogen. So useful to know that. I'll also point out that if I am going to go fully vegetarian and you're giving me advice on having a balanced diet still, like, hey, I still need to take protein in, right? So what would be some good plant parts to eat for protein? Well, if you're thinking about beans, for example, those are a legume. If you're thinking about nuts, for example, those are made by legumes. Right? So no surprise that legumes are a good source of protein because legumes have bacteria in their roots that can do nitrogen fixation. And that makes them have a lot of bioavailable nitrogen compared to other plants, which makes them much more able to synthesize proteins compared to other plants, which is why when we eat them, we get a lot more protein from eating them. So good connection there. And hopefully that helps you to think about all this information. Now, there's another big thing here. This is like the biggest thing that I think a lot of people don't know about. I seriously think this might be the biggest thing that a lot of people just don't know about that you'll learn in this class. And that is something called the Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process was developed right around the early 20th century. It was initially a way of taking nitrogen out of the air and converting it into not only bioavailable forms, but forms that could be weaponized, that could be used to make explosives for war efforts, like in, say, World War I. Well, it turns out that the same type of stuff that can be used to make a bomb can actually act as fertilizer. And, famously in the really horrible and tragic Oklahoma City bombing that happened in the 1990s, I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that. That happened when I was a kid. Fertilizer was actually used as the weapon in that horrifying attack. So these are very similar compounds, and someone recognized, essentially, a chemist recognized, wait a second, you could use this to make bombs. You can also use it to make basically ammonia-based fertilizers. The Haber-Bosch process takes nitrogen gas and jams it together with a source of hydrogen to make ammonia. The reason that this is achievable, because nitrogen gas is not very reactive, inhale, exhale, just goes in and out, right? The reason this is possible is because we can burn fossil fuels. So the 20th century saw massive production of fertilizer because we burn a lot of fossil fuels, we create a lot of heat, we do it inside a contained area where we can achieve hundreds of times the normal atmospheric pressure that's in our rooms right now. So we go hundreds of times atmospheric pressure, really jam that nitrogen in there and make it collide with a source of hydrogen and put it in a really high heat, like hundreds of degrees Celsius. And you will get reactions happening and you will produce ammonia. And you can then spray that ammonia on a field and grow a lot of corn, for example. I'll emphasize to you when we get to agriculture, corn is a great crop to know is a very nitrogen needy crop. It's not a legume. It can't make its own nitrogen fixation happen in its roots. So instead, you need to feed it a lot of nitrogen. If you're familiar with indigenous agricultural practices, you'll know that native people who grew corn in North America also grew with that corn beans. Beans are a legume, corn needs a lot of nitrogen. That's why it's a good couple of crops to grow together. The legume adds nitrogen to the soil, the corn uses a lot. So why can we grow so much corn? Why is corn like the #1 thing that we grow in the United States? Because we can do the Haber-Bosch process and do our own nitrogen fixation and make infinite fertilizer. That also means we can produce way too much fertilizer. It can run off into oceans and other like waterways, freshwater systems, as well as marine systems, where it can cause an explosive and problematic overgrowth of algae that we're going to learn more about later. That process is called eutrophication, cultural eutrophication. It's a major problem. Okay, so 3 methods of nitrogen fixation. Bacteria in the soil or in legume roots or in the ocean. We call them algae. They're really kind of cyanobacteria. Lightning. And then those are the 2 natural ones. And then the third one is the artificial human anthropogenic, meaning human generated one, the Haber-Bosch process, where we make chemical fertilizer. Okay. Once nitrogen is in these bioavailable forms, it is uptaken by plants. The plants make proteins out of it. Proteins, you'll recall, are made of amino acids. It moves around food chains and food webs. We'll get more into that later in the unit. If it gets back into the soil, it's coming from waste from animals or from decaying parts of plants or from dead parts of animals or parts that flake off, detritus and so forth. If decomposition takes place, it can be held in the soil. Basically, it stays in the soil unless it runs off to a waterway, where if it's too abundant, it can cause big problems. Or there happens to be a different set of bacteria that can basically eat these bioavailable forms of nitrogen. You and I couldn't live off this. We require a ton of energy. We're running like a central nervous system with a big old brain that's feeling really entertained right now, I hope. And it needs a lot of energy. If you want to see that in practice, just try not eating for a little bit and then try to like take a difficult test or something, do a difficult intellectual task. You'll have a lot of trouble with it because, you need a lot of calories to power this thing, right? So you and I need to eat much bigger molecules. We need to eat like glucose and things much bigger than that, starches, to power our systems, right, with enough calories. Some bacteria are simple enough and adapted to basically just living off of the tiny little bit of extra energy that's in the bioavailable nitrogen, okay? Where did that energy come from? Well, the lightning or the initial nitrogen fixation investment by the bacteria or the Haber-Bosch process, the fossil fuels that got burned. So the energy went in. It's not a whole big upgrade. It's not like photosynthesis here. We're not investing that much energy. So it's not like good for humans to eat, but some bacteria can live off that. When they eat the bioavailable nitrogen and break it back down, they do it in a series of steps. Again, those steps get complicated. We're not going to worry about the details. Eventually, it tends to make it back into the atmosphere as one of 2 forms: nitrogen gas, N2, molecular nitrogen. And then we're back where we started. Also, it can form nitrous oxide, N2O. That turns out is actually a really serious greenhouse gas. So I think a lot of us know that driving cars and burning fossil fuels in those cars and in other applications like power plants puts CO2 into the air, and that CO2 is causing climate change. I think a lot fewer of us know that dumping too much fertilizer on a field puts so much bioavailable nitrogen that denitrifying bacteria can bloom on the field, where they then break down a lot of that bioavailable nitrogen because there's just so dang much of it, the plants can't even take it up quick enough. And it goes flying back up into the air in part as, unfortunately, a greenhouse gas, and a pretty strong one, nitrous oxide. Don't mean to bum you out there, but there's a lot going on with climate change, right? The good news is that means there's tons of different ways of solving it, right? And we need to do a number of them, and not every one of them, but maybe, but there are ways and we'll get there. But you should know about this. So basically, in the air, pretty useless. Fixation makes it bioavailable. Once it's bioavailable, into food webs and food chains via plants uptaking it. It can get back into the soil if it gets there through waste or through decay of dead parts of these organisms. And it might end up running off into waterways where it can create problems, or if there's too much of it, or if there's the right amount, it can just feed those systems. And finally, it can get back where it started by denitrification, by denitrifying bacteria. Okay, that's the nitrogen cycle. It's kind of a lot, right? So feel free to rewatch this, look up a different video on it, go to the AP classroom and watch a good video on it. All these things will help you. Let's next look at the carbon cycle, the final one. This one I'm not going to belabor too much because we're going to get into a lot of detail on the different parts of it later, actually. And I think more of it's going to be familiar to you, but let me point out a few things here. First of all, there's a lot of stuff carbon does, right? And carbon is pretty central to living systems. So, you know, it's significant. That said, I mean, I will say nitrogen, like I had an ecology professor who made the argument, and I buy it, that life is essentially a competition for nitrogen, more so than anything else. Nitrogen and energy, those are like the two big things, because nitrogen is pretty scarce, right? But anyway, carbon cycle is pretty significant because carbon is central to living things. Obviously, you know, in the air, a common form that we talk about a lot because of its implications for climate change is CO2. CO2 comes out of the air by photosynthesis. That's how it enters food chains. And you know, when we exhale, and when other organisms break down their food and do their equivalent of exhaling, which may or may not involve lungs, but does involve getting rid of CO2 back into the air. So basically, cellular respiration, the breakdown of our food for energy, does release CO2 back into the air. So it comes into organisms from photosynthesis, goes back out from respiration. If stuff dies and decomposes, well, decomposers do their equivalent of breathing it out. If a fungus breaks down a dead thing, it's doing cellular respiration and essentially breathing out the CO2 out of its tissues, again, without lungs, but you get the idea. Now, the other possibility is that the decomposition is somewhat incomplete. Okay, this happens typically when like a lot of organic material, living tissues, get buried in, say, like a swamp. It doesn't have to be a swamp. There are other examples, but I'm just going to ask you to imagine a swamp. It's probably got mud at the bottom, right? It's got a lot of water running into it. It's got a lot of plant life and a lot of animal life too. So mostly there are plants there, and there's lots of plants growing and dying, and leaves are falling into the muck. And if a leaf gets buried in the muck, there's no oxygen. Well, you and I need oxygen to break down our food, and fungus needs oxygen to break down dead stuff. So if dead stuff is exposed to oxygen, it breaks down back to CO2. If dead stuff is buried in muck, say like in a wetland, for example, and there's no oxygen, you cannot have what's called aerobic respiration. Instead, you have a different set of chemical reactions that become possible, where the decomposition does not return the carbon to CO2 in the air. Instead, it converts the carbon over many years and under burial and pressure and all kinds of transformative processes that we'll learn more about when we think about fossil fuels in more detail, but it transforms into fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are not dinosaur bones. They're mostly plants that were once alive that got buried where there was no oxygen, like in a swamp or something, didn't decompose back to CO2, and all that carbon got trapped as coal or oil or natural gas. So you're really burning old plants in your car. That's what you're essentially doing. Oil, you're probably like some kind of like planktonic life from the ocean. But anyway, this is neither here nor there. We'll get more into it later. The key is that if organic matter gets buried and doesn't fully decompose, it forms fossil fuels. If we extract those and burn them in our cars, in our airplanes, in our power plants, other applications, we do burn a lot of fossil fuels in a lot of applications. They're very central to our economy, and they've been very good to us in a lot of ways, and they've created a lot of issues. But if we do that, we burn those fossil fuels, they end up releasing CO2 as a product of their composition. Okay, so when combustion rather, when they're combusted, they release CO2. Now, CO2, there's one other thing here. So you've got respiration and photosynthesis, moving it around living systems. You've got organic matter being buried and storing it long-term in fossil fuels, which normally would just store it for a really long time. Instead, we've got humans digging it up and putting it back in the air, which is how we're making a big change in the Earth system. More on that later. The third thing that can happen is you can get CO2 diffusing into water and dissolving. Now, when CO2 dissolves in water, there's a little bit of chemistry that happens, and I recommend that you kind of learn it. CO2 combines with H2O to make, just add them up, H2CO3. CO2 plus H2O gives you H2CO3. If you write it down and look at it, it will make sense. That's called carbonic acid, right? So the more CO2 that dissolves in the ocean, the more acidic it gets. That's the whole ocean acidification issue. It's a corollary of climate change. Now, once that carbonic acid is in the ocean, it can potentially release carbonates, CO3 2-. And those carbonates can potentially combine with calcium. That reaction is really important because it makes CaCO3, which is limestone. A lot of organisms in the ocean make their shells or their skeletons out of limestone because there's carbonate in the ocean, CO3 2-, and there's calcium in the ocean, Ca2+. And so the organisms, because they have these available to them, will use them to make their shells. So like some microscopic organisms like plankton will do this. Larger organisms like corals will do this. And even larger organisms with, or at least individuals with full-on shells. In many cases, will be making those shells out of calcium carbonate or limestone. So that means limestone is contained in marine sediments. If you ever see limestone cliffs on land, that used to be under the ocean. That's where the limestone formed, or at least it used to be underwater. Okay, it used to be an aquatic environment. That either means sea level was much higher, or it means some kind of earthquake or mountain building activity, tectonic activity, has pushed it up to a higher elevation than it used to be at over a very long period of time. And that's why it's now visible. So that's the deal with limestone. Okay, so 3 things here: photosynthesis, pulling it into organisms; respiration, sending it back. If organic matter from organisms gets trapped with no oxygen, fossil fuels, those stay there for a very long time underground until they get exposed by some enterprising human and burned back to CO2. CO2 can also come out of the air and diffuse into the ocean, dissolve, make carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid can potentially, by dissociating, release carbonate that becomes available to make limestone calcium carbonate. That whole thing can run in reverse too. Calcium carbonate, especially if the ocean gets acidic enough, will dissolve. Want to, dissolve limestone? Pour some acid on it. Doesn't even need to be that strong an acid; it will dissolve. And in fact, if you ever go to a place that has old limestone buildings, like go look at ancient Roman ruins or something, they didn't build, you understand, these buildings with like pockmarked limestone. The reason it looks kind of like pockmarked and like a little bit broken down is because it's been actually weathered by acid rain. So acid rain from industrial pollution in Europe has actually caused their limestone, ancient limestone buildings over time to kind of break down. Also, there's a natural process there too, where acidic rainfall is slightly acidic to begin with, but we'll get more into that later. Industrial pollution has accelerated that process, is what I should say. So at any rate, that's the whole thing. And I hope that this was informative for you. This topic is hard. If this was an overwhelming video, yeah, I kind of figure it will be. And even if I went really slow and took like 2 hours with it, it would still just be like, oh my gosh, so much information. So I recommend you spend some time with this. Spend some time, draw it out for practice, think through each step. It's going to take some time. It's a worthwhile investment, friends, because these transformations are going to so inform your entire experience of the year. The better you understand the 4 cycles you've now learned, or at least begun to think about, the better you understand them and learn them and integrate them into your consciousness and see them outside the window happening and imagine them around you and talk about them with your friends and annoy your family about them and email me for help if you need it and watch videos of them on YouTube and go to the AP classroom. Okay. All right, I get the idea. Right, so definitely worth making that investment now, because it will make the course so much richer for you. So spend some time, and then spend some more time and get good at these. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.